And now it's finally time to look at some results. We are looking at results from the training process of a variational autoencoder that was trained on the MNIST dataset. This variational autoencoder only has 2 latent dimensions. You can in principle train it with as many as you want to. Just for the sake of visualization, I picked 2 because then I don't have to do any transformations to visualize the latent space. And that's what you can see on the left-hand side. That's the latent space of the variational autoencoder evolving over training time. And this still that you can see at the end is the fully trained latent space. And there you can already recognize a very nice feature of this variational autoencoder. The coloring of this latent space is actually encoding the ground truth labels. Remember that the MNIST dataset comes along with labels that we didn't use, but we can now use them to visualize what the variational autoencoder actually learned. And what we can see there is that it actually groups the digits into clusters in this latent space. And the interesting thing is that we never actually told it to do this. We never told it to cluster the digits somewhere in space, but it figured this out because it was beneficial for its training process. So this is a very nice feature that we can already see here. And on the right-hand side, we have samples. Now, because the variational autoencoder has the sampling mechanism, and it also has this prior that we chose, we can generate new samples. And that's a fascinating thing too. We can generate new samples out of the blue after training. And you can see quite some stunning samples too. And the position of the sample corresponds to the position of the latent sample in latent space that the respective sample is based upon. Okay, so the 7s in the top right corner also correspond to latent samples in the top right corner of the latent space. And here we also see some stunning coherences. For example, if you look closely, there are interesting transitions, for example, between the 5s and the 8s. So when you take a 5 and you make the ends of this 5 longer and longer, it suddenly looks like an 8. And that's exactly the kind of coherence that the variational autoencoder extracts. So what we can see is that the variational autoencoder, without us ever telling so, finds features in these digits that we would have never been able to encode by hand. We would have never been able to tell the variational autoencoder or any other model that a 5 is kind of similar to an 8 if you draw a 5 a little longer. Or, for example, that if you write a messy 1, it looks like a 7. This is also depicted here. You can see that in the samples. And you can see that also because 1s and 7s, these are the red labels and the blue labels, they are actually neighboring sections in this latent space. And maybe now this plot convinces you finally that the variational autoencoder is a very, very powerful tool. We told this algorithm nothing about the MNIST data set, and we simply trained 2 neural networks, and these 2 neural networks firstly figured out how to sort these images into very consistent and coherent categories. That's the left-hand side, the latent samples. And moreover, we are able to generate new samples that no one has ever written before and that look stunningly close to the original images. Admittedly, they look a little bit blurry, but that's only due to the fact that we only used 2 dimensions in the latent space for better visualization. If you use more latent dimensions, the results improve and get even better. It's just harder to visualize. And once more, I want to emphasize that we never explicitly told it how handwritten digits look like. It learned all of this in an unsupervised fashion. And maybe now the term unsupervised learning makes more sense. And finally, we can talk about some results from our lab. At the bottom of this page, you can see this citation, which is one of our more recent papers. And if you click on this citation, this is a URL, and it will lead you to a preprint of the paper where you can read about the specifics if you want to. I will not go too much into detail, but I will try to explain to you how this relates to the variational autoencoder and everything you learned in this lecture, and why I also think it's a cool result. Now, as you might know, our group is working with robotics, and in robotics you're dealing with physical systems and with dynamical systems that are governed by differential equations. And one of the questions we ask ourselves is, can we retrieve the differential equations even if we don't know them, but only if we have data from the system, observations from the system? And the answer in this paper is yes, in principle we can. And here's a very simple example of a physical system, namely this pendulum. This pendulum can be described by a differential equation which relates the angle and the angular velocity to the mass and the length of this pendulum, for example. But in principle, all you need is the angle and the angular velocity, that is two states, to fully describe this pendulum system and to tell in which state this pendulum is at this very moment. And now we said, okay, what if we don't have this two-dimensional data directly, but only camera observations, like this 15 by 15 pixel image of this pendulum or video of this pendulum? And of course, this 225-dimensional time series is still governed by this simple two-dimensional system. So the question is, can we extract this from the data in an unsupervised fashion? We don't want to tell it about how a pendulum works, but we only want to give it this data. And the answer of this paper is, yes, we can do that. And to do that, we use a variant of the variational autoencoder. And the extra ingredient we toss in is that we just tell the variational autoencoder that we're dealing with a time series, and this time series is latently governed by a dynamical system. And that's all we tell it. We tell it there is a governing system present, but we don't tell it the exact shape. And then this autoencoding mechanism figures out the optimal way in which this dynamical system must work. And the reason this works is because a good idea of the governing system, of course, helps good reconstruction. And that's the fact that we exploit here. And the results are quite remarkable. And you can see this in this animation. The unsupervised algorithm is able to almost perfectly recover the ground truth. What you can see here is the latent space of this unsupervised mechanism that we developed. And you can see that it has a very well-defined shape. It has this barrel shape. It's a 3D shape. And the reason it's not 2D is very simple. That's because angles are a bit hard to learn in an unsupervised fashion because they are not continuous. Once you reach 2 pi, you jump back to 0. And so it's easier to cast the angle information into 2 dimensions that correspond to sine and cosine because they are nicely continuous. And the coloring that you can see here is the ground truth information that we have when, of course, we developed these time series. So there is some ground truth, but we didn't use that for training. And you can see that it is recovered perfectly by the ordering of these colors. And then something else we're showing here is how the latent state develops. And you can see that given this very natural time series data on the left, the corresponding latent space samples behave exactly like you would expect the physical system to behave. So it slowly goes down to the equilibrium state in the downward position. And this is does in the nicely continuous fashion that the differential equation data does. So the essence is, yes, we can extract differential equations from unsupervised data using neural networks and using this variational Bayes mechanism. And I think this is a very cool result. And you can develop it from the theory that you learned today And if you want to look up the specifics, I can refer you to this paper. One more thing, sorry about these black bars on the left and the right hand side. In order to watch this animation, you have to switch to the Adobe Reader, which is unfortunate, but it's worth looking at these results because you can get some insights into variational Bayes there. Okay, time to summarize what we learned today. We talked about latent variables and their importance, but also their problems, and we talked about graphical models. And we saw that you can use latent variable models for very, very powerful algorithms, like the algorithm you saw on the last slide, where you can extract physical information simply from data. We started off by looking at the Gaussian mixture model, which was kind of the simplest latent variable model we could come up with. And then we found that we need a new kind of technique to solve these Gaussian mixture models, or to learn these Gaussian mixture models, and that was variational techniques. That is, techniques in which you learn functions instead of merely parameters. And then we found that within these variational techniques, the evidence lower bound plays a very important role. And we derived two kinds of algorithms from these variational techniques, or variational Bayes techniques. And the first one was the expectation maximization algorithm. And the second one was the more recent variational autoencoder. And while we were learning about this concept, we had some insights. And first of all, the very intriguing properties of the evidence lower bound. You should keep these in mind. They are very important if you want to work with variational inference. And also the importance of the posterior distribution, and why everyone's trying to learn this posterior distribution either in supervised or unsupervised fashion, because these latent factors are really a very important thing that we want to extract from the data. And then you also learned another trick, that is the reparameterization trick. That was the trick that made it actually possible to train the variational autoencoder. And it's a very nice trick to calculate derivatives of expectations when you're taking derivatives with respect to the distribution parameters. That's it on inference in latent variable models.